You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
All right, hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This month we're having a chat about gender expression, identity, the transgressive power of goth, and some other issues related to the scene, like the differences between goth in America and other places, namely London, the impact of social media, and a bunch of other fun cultural things. We've also got a review of the new album from Second Still and our Sinister Suggestions. So as always, I am the Count, and I'm here with my co-host Trey. Hello, Trey.
Hello, Count. Hello, listeners. Hello, Parma.
And of course, our special guest this episode is London DJ, model, art curatorial producer, and famous person on the internet, Parma Ham. Hello, Parma.
Hey.
Tell us sort of your origin story. How did you get introduced to alternative culture and goth? And let us know where, if people are local or want to find you online, what kind of events you're doing over there.
I mean, don't hate me, but the way it started was probably Marilyn Manson, because this was like this was pre-internet. So I was kind of from quite a small town, and I kind of relied on like CDs that were in pretty normal stores, and Marilyn Manson was the only kind of like different musician there was in like, I mean, it was basically a shopping market, you know, for buying food. So that was where I found a Manson CD. And from there, that kind of like perked like a curiosity in music, I guess. I mean, that was age like maybe 13. So I think that's okay, even though I still love Manson. But from there, like, I guess that was the kind of like where the idea of goth started. And from there, I kind of like learned the origins and got into like Specimen and Sex Fiends and stuff like that. So whatever you think of Manson, like, I still love him because that was my way towards the good stuff. And I still love him now because
we're going to have to end the show right there. Sorry.
Yeah. I fucking love him. So it kind of also has quite a lot of nostalgia to his music because it reminds me of like the early years. And I think that's the same for a lot of people. So what was the next part of the question?
You know, let us know about what kind of events you're running, what the scene there is like. Are there events every weekend, or are they pretty rare? Are there a lot of, you know, new people coming in, a lot of the same people, that kind of stuff?
I'm involved with Torture Garden, so I'm a resident DJ there. That's like a fetish club that's been going since 1990. I don't know if this is true or not, but someone said to me earlier today that used to go to TG in the 90s that someone was killed there from being like flogged to death. So, but like I was trying to Google this, and there are some like mentions of it, but I guess like, you know, 1990s is like pre-internet, so I couldn't really find much of it. And there was some kind of like shitty things about it as well. So there's definitely like, that was the time when the media was kind of trying to demonize goth and things like that. So it could have been bullshit. But I literally just found out about this, and I don't know. I think that sounds kind of exciting. So that's kind of more on the fetish side of things. It started off as a goth club in the early days. I think it kind of music-wise went off a little bit. But since I've been doing that for last year, I've kind of like brought in contemporary, like goth, EBM, and a bit of dark techno. Then I also I co-run a night called Monster Queen, which is kind of like a queer goth club, which incorporates performance and drag. And it's just got this like very undefinable kind of like current moment. It does do goth, it does do EBM, it does everything. And I think that's kind of good right now because it kind of fills a gap, you know, where I think it kind of like, it inhibits the kind of fluidity that we have at this age now, you know, where people don't really want to like commit to like one subculture or one type of music or one type of identity. And I think that's kind of me as well. So that's going quite well. That's celebrates its year anniversary on the 15th of June. Then, of course, I also do Slime Night sometimes, which is like the oldest running goth club, I think, in the world, which is like 30 odd years now. So, yeah, that's my nights. That's like 3 nights a month. So I got one night off, really, one Saturday. And that's usually in another club, which I don't DJ at.
Going back to the fluidity thing you mentioned, since you brought this up, there's a lot of talk about, at least online, about kind of boundary work and trying to delineate what is goth, what isn't goth, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you feel the place for fluidity is, both within goth, or and then outside of goth, do you feel like subcultures in general are moving towards more of a dynamic and identity fluid kind of scene?
Yeah, I guess maybe people grew kind of tired of that, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience that it's not very nice. Well, actually, I'd say for a lot of goths, a lot of them don't want to be defined as goth. I mean, there's so many like famous like goth band examples of people that kind of always refuse that. And that is because, to define yourself is to also limit yourself. And I just don't really see many artists wanting that, because that kind of pigeonholes you into one type of thing. And I guess that maybe that's like how people feel these days as well. And that's kind of like general. That's for everything. Like no one just really, and it's kind of dangerous as well, because you can't just see everything in a binary way. If you're male or female, if you're Republican or liberal, like people like that don't exist. There are no like left or right. I think that kind of like limits the human experience and limits the individual to be one or the other. And I think that's also quite a divisive thing as well, to split people up and say you're this or that. And really, like, I don't know, I don't think division is like the thing that people want or need. It might be attractive sometimes to kind of like have that kind of definition. And it can seduce you in a way into security, but I don't think that's safe or good. And I think maybe people are waking up to that in many ways. I mean, we say like a good example of that would be gender, but I really think that's kind of like applicable to a lot of things in life right now. And I think fluidity is that.
I absolutely agree with what you said. As I was thinking about this, another example I came up with was aging, because I think that's another thing that people tend to try and understand as a rigid set trajectory. And you have this linear process with this set of like universal changes and milestones. But I think it makes more sense to think of aging as individual moments, sets of relations and sets of experiences and memories interacting with one another, interacting in different contexts and different, with different material objects and things like that. And so getting into that, the notion of strict binaries and strict dichotomies, I'm in complete agreement with you. Let me ask you about, before we get too much into goth, some of the other communities that you're involved with, because I guess I'm sort of interested in either social justice issues or just identity in general, where other groups of alternative people coming together fill a different need than goth. So I guess if you could speak a little about your experiences in other subversive communities and why that's valuable to you.
And kind of something that I've kind of like maybe avoided a little bit, because definitely an aspect of this question is defining goth, which is a difficult thing to do and something that will upset a lot of people. And also
nobody has an opinion about that.
Yeah, like I have always like avoided that kind of conversation, and it's just kind of a nightmare, because you do kind of want to like protect what's special about goth, but then you also like don't want to gatekeep it, and also like I can't be fucked to gatekeep it because that's kind of gross. So there's a lot wrong with that. But I suppose with identity, it's like I think it's kind of necessary to have outside influences from other scenes in order to like evolve. And I think goth is no different. I think if it just stays the same, or it doesn't have these outsider influences, or it doesn't change, that means it's in isolation. And then once you have that, it kind of stagnates, and it would just be the same. So, and I think you can kind of, if you look at the goth that we all know, I think it's like it was always many-headed right from the very start. Whether you're looking at kind of like bands like Theatre of Hate or Ozgang, or that kind of like punk kind of side, to bands like London After Midnight or Specimen, like they're worlds apart. Like I can't even imagine those guys in the same room. Like they're different music wise, they're different looks. They're just entirely like, it's kind of weird that they're the same category. So I think goth is good because it's managed to change. And even though a lot of people are in denial of that, and there are a lot of people that don't want it to change, it has to, because it was always a youth movement. And if it doesn't capture like the hearts of the current youth, then it's doomed to fail. And I think that's maybe what happened to a lot of other kind of subcultures that are no longer around. Goth is still going now, and it's like, sadly, I shouldn't say sadly, but one of the things it's captured now is the kind of like Killstar goth, which I kind of despise. But that's just another head, You can't deny it. You can't cut it out. You can't ignore it. It's there. It's part of it. I mean, I went to a Sex Gang Children gig last week, and everyone there was 50, It was like such a kind of gig based on nostalgia. And I don't know, I don't think goth in its purest form is a nostalgic thing. That was just people looking back on what was, not what is.
Or sort of taking nostalgic influence and perverting it and modifying it.
Yeah. I feel like that's what kind of like the best bands of today do. That's kind of what I try and do. I'm inspired by the past, but I'm always forward looking. Like I don't really get much pleasure or see the point in imitating the past. Like it's being done, goth is still an art form. What is the fucking point in like recreating the past? Like no one does that. You're doomed for failure if it's just a repeat. So if we look at a lot of music these days, like I'd say there's quite a lot of like EBM and techno influences. And I'd probably say that's largely due to the fact that the techno scene is like booming right now. Like I would say that kind of is the alternative scene in London, and the queer scene in London is all techno. Whereas like in the 80s, that was completely different.
I do agree with the techno and EBM influences, especially within the club culture aspect of things within goth spaces. That's been a fairly consistent trend since the turn of the millennia, and definitely in queer spaces, even in both the U.S. and overseas, has been very heavily influenced by the techno and electronic dance scenes. So it is interesting how things are moving that way. So yeah, I think it is interesting, and I do like the evolution. I do think there is a place for nostalgia in goth, but it is more of, like you were saying, a referential point. It's not a limit. It's not a cage. You don't want things to always be like they were, but you want to be able to reference that and use that as a touch point.
Let's let me ask you about this then, because gender identity and gender expression have been one of those things that you've spoken about in interviews. You get asked about, and you're sort of an advocate for. So when it comes to the work that goth culture does, or the space that goth culture provides, I'm interested on your take as far as, does it do that work? Does it make a space for people that want to express themselves, their sexuality, their gender, and everything in different ways, in more of a fluid, like, spectrum framework? Or have you had different experiences than that?
Yeah, so I'd say my experience of going to like alternative and particularly goth spaces such as clubs, gigs, festivals. There's a huge visibility of transgender and gender nonconformers, or just generally LGBT people, really. That kind of has to suggest there must be a welcoming atmosphere. I've never encountered any problems. I would say the leaders in the scene, like the musicians, the staff, are very kind of like, I don't know, I think there's almost something kind of like intrinsically camp about goth as well. You know, if you look at Roz or Peter Murphy or London After Midnight, all that makeup, you know, the long hair, the nails, that's you know, the kind of vampy kind of like really, that's camp to me. I don't know if it could be anything else, but that itself kind of like leans itself towards the kind of gender bend in itself. In a way, I kind of think that goth hasn't always been given the kind of hasn't really been mentioned for kind of leading the way, I would say, in that. If you look at some of the two biggest pioneers of fluidity, like Boy George or Pete Burns, you know, they took fluidity to the mainstream in the 80s, but they both had, you know, goth phases. And I think that kind of fashioned them into the icons they are. And I think that kind of shows that goth always had that kind of scope in it. And it's strange because the discussion around gender and fluidity has only just started, like maybe the last 5 years or so. Like I myself has kind of identified as a gender for the last couple of years. But when I look back into my past, I've actually not changed in 10 years. It's just the terminology that is new.
I consider myself non-binary. I generally present masculine, but just out of sort of necessity in my situation. But I also had one of those moments where I was just sort of talking about how I perceive gender the way that I've always seen it, and, you know, the way that it's, you know, culturally constructed, and that, you know, what's feminine or masculine for one culture or the other is different, and that the best biological science we have is, you know, basically affirms the idea that gender is a spectrum and can be fluid and that kind of thing. And I was shocked that people I had known for so long all of a sudden started kind of treating me differently because I had put a name to it. And I don't know if it was an association with like a political thing or some like hidden bigotry or what it was, but that was a unsettling experience for people I had known for so long, and I didn't feel like I had changed or been different than I had ever been. But
wow, that's really sad. Do you think that's like an American thing?
Maybe. I mean, the problem with that question is I would have to have in-depth knowledge of a different culture to compare it against, so I'm not totally sure I could say it is. I mean, obviously Americans are, at least the discourse is that there's a lot of division and a lot of you're this or you're that, you're on this side, you're on that side kind of thing. And there's a lot of conversation about gender and sex right now that I think people are associating with political discourse, and they get that's what pisses them off. I don't know. What do you think, Trey?
I think there's a lot of this that has to do with just general confusion around this thing that a lot of people grew up with as a bedrock of their understanding of other people, which is, you know, gender. Are you a boy or a girl? Are you a man or a woman? And what assumptions they can make because of that is basically just been yanked out from under people. And I think people are dealing with that very, very poorly. And I think the other part is that it's exploded so hugely, so vocally, and in so many fractured things that, I mean, people can probably come to terms with the idea that there's men, there's women, and there's, you know, there may be some fluidity in there, but then, well, kind of the internet got a hold of it, and identity became, you know, sort of a giant vocabulary test. And now that we have your gender fluid, agender, demi boys, demi girls, anti genders, all of these things, and people are just getting overwhelmed by this terminology that's allowing people to, individual people are able to glom onto an identity that works for them, and that's great. It's good to have all these ideas around gender because it's good that people who have otherwise not found acceptance because they didn't fit in the binary and didn't have a good term and maybe weren't comfortable with that sort of nebulous, well, if I'm not a man or a woman, I must be trans or I must be gender queer or gender fluid or something. But that didn't really give them that identity they were seeking. But by that same token, those people who do fit within the cisgender binary and are comfortable in that paradigm become very discomfited by the fact that now they have to know what it means when someone comes up to them and says they're a pangender demigirl. And that's certainly scary and off-putting, and I can understand some of the hostility towards it. I definitely think it's overblown, and I think people need to calm down a little bit and just kind of accept it, and just, like I say in a lot of things, use it as a jumping point to start a conversation. It's okay if you don't know every single one of these identities is in depth. But when somebody says, oh, I'm not a boy, I'm not a girl, I'm blah.
Yeah, don't call me that.
Then, respect the pronouns, don't dead name people, and, have a conversation about them. If you care about the person, find out what they mean when they say they're, agender or whatever.
I kind of like, as I was hearing that, I kind of felt like it seems quite a lot of people are scared of change, and they're generally scared of freedom. And I think a lot of people maybe react poorly to that. But bringing it back to the goth scene, I've never encountered any negativity, like, ever. And most places I go, I've seen so many of these posters in kind of like goth environments that say, no transphobia, no homophobia, no Nazism, that kind of like, there's just a list of like 50 no's. And I would say that's kind of across the board at any goth place I've been to. That kind of, it's always been that way, it's always been accepting. And quite anecdotally, like, that's what I've experienced, is going to these places and just seeing all kinds of genders. And this is like, 10 years ago. And it just kind of all went together, and it wasn't a problem. There was cross-dressers with trans people, and it just kind of worked, And the only thing I kind of miss is, like, maybe 10 years ago, this conversation makes everything very political, and sometimes it's nice not to be, I think Pete Burns was someone that did that very well, is no one really knew what was going on with their gender because they refused to talk about it. They simply were the person they were. And if you look at them, they were beautiful, but they were kind of free from being told or being asked to boy or a girl. They just literally said, fuck off, mate. Like, and though I absolutely love that this conversation is happening, and it does help people. I mean, I kind of wish I knew it before, but at the same time, it's kind of exhausting that this keeps being repeated. And kind of look forward to the day that we can just kind of forget about gender altogether. I mean, that's how I feel as an agender person. I have absolutely no kind of like, I have no feeling towards it. It's a completely dead thing to me.
For me, what I kind of gravitated to as a general concept is, I mean, while I do identify as agender, since that's the, I guess, quote unquote official term, I kind of coined myself as anti-gender, though I know that does mean something else when I looked it up, or it's a contentious term within the trans community, apparently, when I looked it up, in that it's not a sense of being against gender, but it's being, you're an anti-boy or an anti-girl, which means you're just not a boy or a girl. Whereas I view it as I am against the concept of gender and think it doesn't have a place functionally in our society anymore. We need to learn to accept each other as individuals and not try to just take that mental shortcut of assuming just because of some presentation quirks or biological happenstance that we know a person's soul just because of what they have or don't have between their legs. So I think, sex has a purpose when it comes to procreative roles, but when it comes to functioning in society, I think we need to decouple functioning in society from our biological sex and just, we do what we're good at, not what our biological sex makes others think we're good at.
Yeah, and I mean that's such a reductionist idea anyway. I don't, if anyone's familiar with Judith Butler, I would recommend checking out some of her work. She's a gender theorist that I really like. I'm also gonna, because I want to try and keep this specific to goth. I know we could certainly have a very long discussion about gender specifically. For anyone listening, I'm going to put probably 2 or 3 YouTube video links to some content from ContraPoints about some of those issues that you brought up, Trey, because I think she covers them really, really well, better than I could. So Parma, then let me sort of bring this back to goth then and touch on something you mentioned, because we have, if you want to talk about gender or talk about someone who identifies themselves mostly as a goth, you have this discussion around, is goth political or should it be political? And I'm both interested in hearing your perspective from being in another country, but I think it also sort of parallels with gender because, like you were saying, this is just who I am. I shouldn't have to necessarily have this discussion and try to defend myself and explain culture and science and everything to everyone. But on the other hand, does it also function as something that is transgressive, and it's important because it's transgressive? So there's like that balance between being political and just trying to be yourself, I guess. I don't know if that made any sense.
I'm trying to grapple with it.
So let me try and break that down. Maybe start with do you find that goth over there is more engaged with politics, or are they more like, leave us alone, we just want to do our own thing?
I know when you did pose this question before, like in the notes, and I just kind of struggled with it because I know even when you said like goth as political in the 80s, to be honest, I didn't really get it, because sure, goths can be political, but I wasn't really sure if I never really saw that as being part of goth. It's just something else they do. It's like goths cook food as well, but we're not exactly like, that's not intrinsically goth either. So that was why I was kind of a bit stunned by it. I guess you just have to look to see what goth is, and that is its music and fashion. And I don't really, I guess that's claims on identity, but then I don't really know if they get that involved with political decisions beyond that. I wish they were, but they seem to be more add-ons. I don't know. I mean, punk music was very political. At least a lot of the goth music I listen to is kind of not so. But then it is, if you consider the very fact that, like, gender and that aspect of it is very in right now, and it is actually a political moment in time as we're going through like some sort of trans liberation thing. So it is important to accept that side of it. But as far as like Brexit goes and Trump, I don't really feel like goth has that much to say on it itself. I'd like to hear another opinion, because I might be able to like bounce off it.
Well, Trey, you could probably speak to this too. I guess we've been bouncing this back and forth. We recently did a Patreon episode where we were reading a book from Carl Sprecklin, who I believe is somewhere in the UK. But he made this argument about goth in the 80s being inherently political and transgressive, and that's what made it valuable. And he talks about, I think he uses examples from Gang of Four and some sister songs and some other things, and saying that goth was very much, or almost as much, about pushing against Thatcherism and that kind of thing, that almost as much as punk was. And there's also a different argument that if you are just by the very fact that you are living an alternative lifestyle, that itself is inherently political, or I guess intrinsically political, because it is subversive or different to the sort of heteronormative moral expectations of culture at the moment.
Refine that a little bit by saying not just living an alternative lifestyle, but publicly living an alternative lifestyle,
Sure.
doing it out in public, in front of other people, being out and proud and all of that. Even if you aren't out protesting, your very presence is making a statement about an alternative that exists. And I think that's the political aspect, whether it is intended as something that's trying to subvert the norms of society or not. It is still an expression of an alternative, and I think that's where at least I come down on the political side of things.
Okay, so yeah, I completely get that, and I guess that's what I kind of meant when I was referring to like gender identity and things like that. That's where it has something to do with it, and I kind of, in my experience, that's kind of what I meant as well by saying I kind of grew a bit bored of always being seen as political, because there's absolutely no hiding from looking and behaving and being different. Like everything in my life is like somehow a kind of resistance to the norm. It just is. So I kind of see that. But at the same time, I feel like these kind of small identity politics are very kind of individualistic. And in a way, like, you're not going to stop deforestation or, global warming by me backcombing my hair in London. I think that's kind of where I feel like, sure, there's a political aspect to it, but as far as like creating big change or actual political issues that are kind of like life-threatening, because I guess global warming is life-threatening, I don't really know if Goth has much to like really do on that.
Depends on the product you use.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the amount of like hairspray that Goth has done, I think we're kind of like the opposite of helping global warming.
Let me run this one other idea past you, just because I'm interested to hear your perspective on it, and then we'll kind of move away from gender. But when it comes to, you spoke about how Goth spaces had been safe for all different types of presentations and expressions. I do have this one criticism that I haven't necessarily gotten past yet, and it has to do with, and again, this is specific both to my experience and people I've spoken with, but of course, all of these things can be different region to region, country to country, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in some ways, Goth does or can reinforce heteronormative ideas of gender when it comes to who is rewarded, how people are rewarded, like cultural capital or, respect and admiration based on their appearance. Because it seems to me, women are often expected to present more hyper feminine. And then when it comes to men having some feminine presentations, they get more of a reward for being seen as more transgressive, but still sort of seen as men that are wearing makeup. Whereas on the other side, women who present more masculine don't get as much admiration for their look, while men who still dress in a goth, more masculine style will still get social capital from that. So either way that the men go, there sort of seems to be an imbalance there. I will say that I do think that has changed over the last few years. You mentioned that this has sort of exploded into the cultural discourse recently, But my kind of gripe with that, at least from here, is that the push of the change that I've seen in goth club spaces when it comes to trans acceptance and just gender identity in general has come from outside of goth, from like leftists and progressives and that kind of thing, and then goths sort of following that, rather than the goths themselves starting the conversation and changing the way that we see it.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I actually had a female friend say exactly the same thing. She actually complained that it was hard for her to really appear transgressive as a female in the goth scene while also still presenting goth. She ended up shaving her head, and I don't know, I've seen that quite a lot in the goth scene, that there's quite a lot of, bald females. I guess it doesn't have the same weight, but I guess that would be it. That's all they can really do. But I would say that kind of imbalance is maybe due to, I think maybe females had that transgressive moment in punk, which, it just came before. There was loads of Mohicans, and I think the punk rock was the moment where female masculinity kind of like shocked the world. And then goth came along and it did the opposite of that. And it had more feminine men. And then I guess maybe, I don't know, it's dangerous to say, but maybe it could be harder for men to be feminine due to the homophobia and transphobia that's, been around since forever. And though females are still recipients of well, all kinds of shit from men, but I'd say that homophobia was kind of like that bad, especially in the 80s. I don't know, what are your takes on that?
So I guess for where I would come from on that, and I think your comment about punk being that transgressive space where women first got to truly experiment with a strong form of masculinity, dovetails with my experience in the goth scene, in that there's the one area of the goth scene that seems to accept a more masculine or at least androgynous female form is in the death rock scene, which is one of the more close to punk varieties of the gothic subculture. So it does seem that there's an aspect of that. And then going on kind of what you were saying before with the social transgression, the degree of social transgression that it takes for a man to be feminized versus a woman being masculinized. There is a distinction there, because even in, standard society, it's more acceptable, at least nowadays, for women to do things that are traditionally considered masculine, be it, shorter haircuts, be it suits, pants, whatever.
Well, now, not to interrupt, but nowadays, I would say nowadays specifically, because I think the idea that, oh, that's a tomboy or that's a lesbian or that's a whatever, as a stigma around women not presenting feminine all the time or being shamed for being ugly when they're not wearing makeup, that kind of thing. I think that is happening less now, but I still think that was a problem for women, like being forced into a feminine aesthetic.
True. It has gotten better. But I do think there is a little bit more social freedom in presentation for women to experiment with their appearance. Whereas men, if you diverge from a traditional masculine appearance, whether it is wearing feminine clothing, whether it is growing your hair out, whether it is growing your nails out, wearing makeup on your face, whatever it is usually reacted to in fairly extreme manners, even if it's only a minor divergence from what is considered the norm. So I would say that there is more leeway in traditional society for women in the gender expression domain exclusively. That's not to say that they have a lot of freedom everywhere else, but when it comes to gender expression specifically, there is a lot more wiggle room. So it's harder for them to be truly transgressive on a gender perspective. Whereas men, it takes almost no effort really to be transgressive in a gender sense. You change one article of clothing and all of a sudden people are aghast.
Well, since you brought up fashion, let's just jump into that then. Because Jesus Christ, Parma, the absolutely stunning, beautiful, fashion you and your friends and the nights that you have over there are fucking incredible. So I want to talk a little about extreme fashion. I guess the thing I was most interested in, sort of bringing it back to goth, is that on the one end you have people complaining about how goth fashion is more identifiable and being commodified, sold in stores, used sort of some idioms are being used as from pop stars and from celebrities and that kind of thing. Goth fashion in the 80s and 90s was a lot more, I guess you could make maybe disagree. I think you can make the argument that it was a lot more transgressive, a lot more shocking. So now that it's more readable and identifiable and even accepted by people outside the culture, do you feel like it's become more passé and these other new forms of fashion are taking the place of that?
Where to start with that one, really?
So I guess if I break it down into two different parts, the first part is, do you feel like goth fashion is being commodified, is being sold, is being used by pop stars, and is that a problem? And then the other part is more generally, the other types of fashion that you're involved with. Why is that meaningful for you? And did you need to step away from goth to to find that meaning?
All fashion is kind of commodified the moment it comes out, and I think that's been happening with goth since it started way back. And it's commodified both for celebrities with, fashion houses doing, the most stunning, beautiful goth runways, but, that's so far removed from the music and the actual club scene that really it kind of in some ways feels a bit appropriated. And then there's also the clothes that, enter the shops, whether that's like Hot Topic, whether it was Lip Service, whether it's Disturbed or now whether it's Killstar. That's something that's been commodified, and in a way, like, it loses something individual and something kind of special that, goth was at the start. And I kind of like maybe try and ignite that a little bit with what I do and with what I wear. Because I guess like what I said earlier is there's no point in like repeating what's been done before. And I feel with like quite a lot of brands these days, it's the same thing. To be honest, sometimes I look through my Explore page on Instagram and like everyone looks the freaking same, especially if you type goth in, it's a hashtag. Like, but maybe that's always what's happened,
Yeah, I certainly think there is some of that. I do think there has always been some degree of commodification and some degree of a uniform. There are people that were just tried to dress like Robert Smith all the time or whatever. So, and I do think some of that fluidity has always been there. And I do think that the more extreme fashion has always been there, just maybe not within goth, but I think that's okay. And I think that people get so hung up on, like you were saying, using a label or saying I'm goth, I'm this, I'm that, and I think some embracing that you can move through and be part of many different things, and that can bring a lot of meaning and diversity to your life is that I think that's a good thing.
I think some of what you were saying around where you're saying that, when you look up in Instagram hashtag goth and things like that, where you're seeing almost a uniform, you're seeing a lot of the same thing over and over and over again. I don't know if that's so much a reflection of the culture and a loss of that individuality and individual expression, and more maybe an effect of the internet and the fact that the internet has become so large and yet so categorizable where we've got algorithms that group things that are like each other. Everybody, exists in this. I mean, the hashtag world is specifically designed to find things that are just like other things, which is why there's such a flowering of different hashtags. If you just use one single hashtag, if hashtags are working as I think they're designed to, you're going to continually get the same sort of thing. And that's maybe part of why there's been such a fracturing in all these different labels for things now that now that in order to see some variety, you need to be looking up more specific things, be it, new goth or trad goth or romantic goth or whatever. As much as we decry those, I think that is more of an artifact of our hashtag culture, because hashtags are designed to show the same stuff. So we have to give it another term so that if you want to see something different, you just have to know the different term, which is, I don't know. I think it's a negative because I like seeing the variety. I like being able to look up a general term and seeing a whole panoply of different interpretations. But at the same token, sometimes it's frustrating when I'm wanting to get a specific look and I'm having to figure out exactly what I need to put in to find that.
Well, and that's part of what makes youth cultures subversive as well, because it's that evolving and changing of terminology and saying, you've taxonomized this, but you don't know about, the deep web, whatever new thing is. And I think that tension there is good, because you don't necessarily, I don't go so much in for the idea that once a fashion is identifiable and definable, it doesn't have meaning anymore. But that sort of back and forth between, we're going to change what this means so it remains meaningful to us, against the, categorized hashtags of everything else. That's always been there, but I think that's valuable in itself, that tension.
Yeah, I want to say maybe the internet and Instagram is a beautiful thing. It's brought many kind of interesting and strange developments for goth. But at the same time, a major drawback is the way the internet works, which is through the filter bubble, meaning that the internet kind of decides what it shows you, and you can't always find or even look beyond that. Facebook is designed to give you and show you political opinions that match your own in order to not upset you, in order to keep you using their website. And I think that's kind of not really good for goth or for anything that needs outsider influences. I mean, in politics, that's a complete mess, isn't it? Because suddenly you've got multiple sides that don't converse with each other at all, and all they do is reinforce their opinions and their bigotry. And I guess that also works in fashion. So yeah, if you type in goth, you're just going to come back with the exact same thing. People with the exact same eyebrows, it's weird.
We could go so many ways with the internet as a thing, but have you, obviously you've had a few videos of yourself go viral, and I've seen you commenting quite witty banter on a few goth Facebook groups and in some other threads and things. What's your general opinion on goth on the internet, goth on YouTube, goth in forums? Is it any reflection of what's actually happening with people going to clubs, or is there, has it become this whole other entity unto itself?
I mean, I'm pretty sure it's a good thing. It is a huge question. I'd say maybe it's good that it connects people together. So maybe that were, goths in some really isolated location or in other countries that suddenly have access to the last 30, 40 years of goth in America and the UK and elsewhere in Europe. And I think maybe that might help with burgeoning scenes, in Africa or somewhere, which somehow is appearing. So I guess it's a positive thing there. I definitely agree that it's kind of become a thing unto itself, and it's kind of given rise to a new form of goth star or celebrity, that just simply wasn't there before. Before it was always band members. And you might get the odd model, And, that was okay, but that's also kind of limiting. I mean, there wasn't really any reason why it had to be a band member. Damn, YouTubers, like, Black Friday is like bigger than most goth bands these days, like it's kind of a weird thing to be thrown into the mix, and it's weird because I don't want to like in some ways it kind of divides goth from the music, which because you don't have sound on Instagram, so that could be a negative, but I would say generally it brings people together, and I'd say that Leipzig is just kind of growing.
Well, you brought up Vegete, and I wanted to ask specifically about that because there was, going back to the issue of, taxonomizing goth fashions. There have been complaints for a while now about Whitby Gothic Weekend becoming this thing where normal people, well, quote unquote, normal people are just going to dress up and have a laugh and not really engaging or interested in the music or goth culture or whatever. They're just kind of weekenders. On the other end of that, with Wave Gothic Treffen expanding and continuing to be a thing, has some of that crept in, or has it largely remained this insider subcultural thing?
Yeah, it's a good point to make, and it's difficult because like I've not been to Whitby, but it is for the reason you just described, and I don't want to speak negatively towards it because there are still good bands that play, there are still good people that go, and there are still good DJs, but it definitely seems to me that Whitby especially was taken over by this kind of like fancy dress kind of crowd and kind of steampunkers and I don't know, all this kind of other shit which I have absolutely no interest in and kind of don't really get why it's been put with goth. And it's, in a way, it's kind of offensive because it kind of treats it as a kind of a costume thing where, goth isn't a costume, is it? This is the way people live, the way people dress. And, it's, people are welcome to come along and experiment and have fun, but I kind of don't really see where the similarities lie whatsoever when it's kind of treated like this weird Disney kind of experience, And that is kind of sad. But at the same time, like, I kind of don't care. If people are having fun, then that's nice. It's just a shame it kind of has to be lumped with the goth stuff. Like, can't they just do their own event, So if Whitby is lost, so be it. Like, fortunately with Wave Gothic Treffen, there's so much happening that, you don't have to go to like the Gothic picnic or whatever it's called. It's an okay event. I've been, it's nice. There are nice people there. But there are some like, bizarre dress up situations, it's great, it's fun. But I don't really know if that's really much to do with goth. But, some goths as well also like that too. They might go see a few goth bands and then do that, which is also totally cool. But I think the problem only arises when, we have a Whitby Light situation where it actually kind of takes over. And to start with, it took over in the press because that was the thing that, mostly got reported, it's kind of these crazy ass costumes that look like a hen party. But eventually it physically seemed to take over. And it, now that kind of is all it is.
Let's do this real quick. Before we do the album review and close out the show, considering that you are a DJ, you mentioned off air that you've been DJing Slimelight for a year. And maybe you can talk about some of that, but I'm interested in like, what are you excited about now with both goth music and even from outside of that? And then what kind of music is getting played at some of the various clubs there? Because it always varies, right? Some clubs they'll say we play Covenant every week and it's always these old classics. Some clubs are like all we ever play is brand new underground stuff and we don't hear any of the old standards or anything like that. So what are you excited about and what kind of stuff is getting played within your community?
I guess what we touched on earlier, which is there's a lot more EBM happening, a lot more dark techno. Outside of goth, like techno has literally exploded in London over the last year and a half. Like I swear the amount of club nights has tripled. And I'd say maybe because of that, a lot of that has kind of creeped into Slimelight and has creeped into like a lot of other clubs. I'm not complaining, I think it's great. But I can see how maybe some purists might be bothered by that. I'd say I'm pretty into Contravoid right now. I actually think maybe there might be quite a few like bands kind of strangely collaborating, like the Soft Moon. You know, I think they released an album not long ago that was kind of like entirely mixed by dark techno acts like Silent Servant or whatever. You know, so that's kind of interesting. But again, that's all on the EBM side of stuff. Tell me how America is. Maybe that'll help me a bit, you know.
Well, in general, it's not that dissimilar to how you're describing the London scene. We do have a lot of the techno-influenced EBM, agro-tech type things that get played. And I think a lot of that's just down to what's been conceptualized as club fare, what is appropriate to play in a club because it's danceable. We've become more and more influenced by the idea that danceability has everything to do with that steady kick drum and those hallmarks of your electronic dance styles. And a lot of the more traditional goth styles or post-punk, punk, death rock, revival type stuff that's still coming out is viewed as not something that people can dance to. It's more stuff that you listen to on your own, just because the concept of dancing has changed culturally in general, in my experience. So I do see a lot of that in most of the clubs that I go to. There are generally pretty heavy in the EBM, light industrial side of things, the very quote-unquote dancey style. But we do still have at least a few nights that will harken back to more traditional goth rock style sounds, whether it's going back to classic tracks and playing Your Sisters and Bauhaus and whatnot, or playing new stuff that have been released in the last couple of decades, but are harkening back to some of those old styles, those old sounds. I definitely am personally partial to having the variety. So I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm a purist, but I am someone who's a little bit annoyed with the prevalence of some of the dancier EBM style stuff. Not that I don't like it, because I do enjoy it. I just wish it wasn't so dominant. I wish it was still had the variety of musics getting played, because I just like to see it switch up. It's nice to have the EBM tracks for the people who want to go out there and stomp or industrial dance or whatever they like to do to express themselves. But it's nice to have throw in an ethereal piece or some rockier, punkier type fare to, you know, get a different aspect of the crowd, just to change up the dance floor a little bit. So I would like to see a little bit more of that. But again, club culture, as it has become culturally, is very much about finding a musical thematic groove and just holding to that in that sort of beat match mixed work of art by the DJ, where it's not really about songs anymore. That is more in the pop clubs. The goth type clubs still do have the concept of individual tracks being played. I've not seen much where it seems to be tried to mix into one long piece like an electronic night would, but it's still kind of going with that same idea where it's gravitating to a single feel that's extended over a long period of time to keep the dance floor moving. So yeah, that's kind of the rough feel I have towards a lot of the goth clubs that I've gone to in the last couple of decades across the US.
I totally agree. You took the words out of my mouth there. There seems to be like, maybe because of how how prevalent techno is right now, there's quite a lot of pressure as a DJ to create one long piece, you know, to not have individual songs. I feel that. And there's definitely this sort of sense that things have to be perfectly mixed and sound great. And actually that's quite hard to do if you're doing goth rock. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're doing something with a kind of beat, that's kind of easy to do. You can beat match it. It's really easy, and it will kind of go together. And I think maybe, for me anyway, the comparisons, maybe because I do also DJ dark techno, so when I come to the more gothier things, I kind of feel like I should apply the same kind of principles that I do there. But that's kind of difficult. It can be done, but I guess maybe in the world of like superstar DJs these days, people kind of expect more from a DJ than just picking tracks.
Yeah, it's very hard to mix together things that are very disparate in style, and you rely more on very quick smash cuts and knowing exactly how the music goes, rather than going with a steady beat where you can easily beat match them up and then slowly transition from one track to another in a seamless manner. You're dealing more with mood of music and maybe a thematic consistency as you jump from one track to another while trying to maintain a steady beat when you're mixing at tracks that may not have been recorded to a click, so may not be a steady beat through their entire length.
And it kind of it's strange because a few years ago I didn't really notice when DJs did that kind of stop-start thing, and there actually are quite a few that do that in London to the point where it's kind of a bit awkward. And I think recently that's other people have been like kind of feeling that way as well. So I think maybe that could it itself be affecting music and what's being played.
Album review.
A little peek beneath the kimono here. If I'm on top of things, I schedule these shows and get the notes together about a month beforehand, which I'm not always on top of things. But in this instance, sometimes stuff catches up with you. So this episode, we're going to be reviewing the self-titled album from Second Still, the extended edition version of it. And just a few days ago, I think 2 or 3 days ago, they released a brand new album. So I haven't prepared for that, so we're not going to be reviewing that album. But hey, you know what? You don't have to always be on top of everything. But so I'm gonna play a track from this album, and I think I'm gonna play. Let me see. I'm gonna play track 6, which is titled Joe.
You wear your
So I'm going to start off with I really did enjoy the album. I liked it quite a lot. That being said, however, I didn't find it, while I found it enjoyable and very comfortable, I didn't find it particularly interesting. It was very, similar to a lot of other things. It makes me want to think, my thought process is, I really do enjoy female fronted goth rock. So it fit with that. I enjoyed that. I thought the music was good, it was well crafted. It was certainly in style. The singer was good. She fit the style as well. But then the question that comes to mind is, what would drive me to listen to Second Still instead of Mephisto Waltz or Skeletal Family or any other one of the dozens upon dozens of female-fronted goth rock bands? And I couldn't really come up with a good answer for that because they didn't really distinguish themselves in a way that really grabbed me and grabbed my attention to say, oh, this is something neat about this band. This is something unique about this band that makes me gravitate towards it. I mean, there is an aspect of my taste in music where I gravitate towards bands which have a very unique sound to them, be it a singer with an unusual voice or a different vocal style, like, as I mentioned, Skeletal Family. You can usually really easily recognize a Skeletal Family track because it's a very clear vocal style, a very clear instrumental style that doesn't really match with a lot of other things. Whereas Second Still, very well crafted, very well done. But, when it comes to Second Still, it's not necessarily as identifiable. It doesn't have something that really says, oh, yes, I turn on this track and I immediately know, oh, this is a Second Still song, rather than any one of their myriad influences. So from that aspect of it, I was a little bit disappointed in that, but that's just because my taste, I tend to gravitate towards stuff that tweaks my ear in a way that, oh, this is novel and different. This is exciting and new. Whereas it is nice to be comforted by music that you grew up with and music that you love. But that's not where my drive usually is when it comes to music. So this is, I think, a great album for someone that likes pretty traditional goth rock, female fronted, leaning a little bit towards the shoegazy, dream pop kind of things and the very more atmospheric, yet it is still very guitar fronted. It's not a synth based track. It's very guitar fronted. It's very rock based. So if you're into that, you'll love this track. I actually did listen to some of the newer album as well. The newer album grabbed me a little bit more. It seemed they were branching out a little bit. They were stretching their legs a little bit. It's still veering traditional, but they were getting away from a very traditional sound, and it felt like they were finding their own voice. So I'm more excited to listen to that one a little bit more. I only briefly touched on that one more recently. But overall, it's a really good album. If you like female-fronted goth rock, I think it's a great find, a great pick. So, I would say go for it if you're into that. If you want something unique, different, or something that really grabs your ear, this probably won't be it, but it is a comfortable refuge in goth rock.
I guess I would find it difficult to judge another artist. I can only say that I didn't find it particularly interesting. So maybe I kind of have to agree with the vocals were just kind of it just wasn't very strong. That's all I can really say about it. Like, everything should have been a bit stronger. There's nothing about it that particularly grabbed me. And I can tell that it was nice and there was something beautiful there, but I don't feel like there was anything fresh or anything new. There are other things.
Okay, cool. So my thoughts, and yeah, I agree on that sentiment. There wasn't anything new here, right? It was, Suki-san, the singer, she had that kind of more ethereal, dreamy delivery. There was a little bit more of spoken word kind of stuff in there, which kind of generally matched the guitar work and the synthesizers, kind of a blend of like Cocteau Twins and Dance Society, which if you're really into that 80s dark synth sound, I think this will be a good album for you, because, you know, some people I talk to, they're like, I've listened to whatever X 80s band for 30 years. I love that sound, but I don't want to listen to the same album over and over. So give me something that sounds like that, but is, you know, new. And I think that's where this kind of niche is, where these bands sort of find their niche, right? So if you are like Trey, I know you're very much into give me variety, give me something new and interesting, sort of subvert what I expect, that kind of thing. This won't be for you. But if you are one of those people that are into the like meandering 80s dark synth, dream wave kind of stuff, then this will be a good album for you. Track 6 I played. I really liked it because her vocal delivery reminded me a bit of Susie, and the track itself reminded me a bit of a Susie song. So again, it's kind of aping something that came before, but I think they do it well, and I think for what it is, it's really enjoyable. I haven't had a chance to listen to the new album. You know, for me, I have both moods. I want to hear something new. Sometimes I just want to hear a classic sound that I'm comfortable with, sort of that I can immediately recognize and get into, and have that kind of an experience. So let's close out with our Sinister Suggestions.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
So Sinister Suggestions, if you don't know, is a portion of the episode where we recommend something we've been enjoying, listening to, reading, watching, partaking in the last few weeks. Trey, why don't you tell me what your Sinister Suggestion is?
I've got a couple. It's going to be in books this time. And I'm keying on our ideas, or the main topic of our discussion, which was some gender identity stuff. One on a more academic side of things. I don't think I've recommended this before, but I believe I'm double checking the author, but the book is called Delusions of Gender. I believe the author is, yes, Cordelia Fine. The basic premise of that book is kind of the counterpoint to this biological predisposition of gender, not of sex, but of gender. The ideas that have been bandied about for years about how there are male brains and female brains, your men are from Mars, women are from Venus type tropes. And it kind of looks at some of the research and some of the evidence to discredit those ideas, and really emphasizes some of the more, some evidence that there is more of a social aspect to it. It's a socialized habit rather than something inherent in biology. So I think it's a really enjoyable book. It can get a little technical at places, but I think it's relatively approachable. It's by far not a deep academic style thing, but it is discussing, research and studies and things like that. And then in a little bit more of a literary bent, this is going to be a relatively old book. It's The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. It was released in 1969, and it's probably one of the first sci-fi books that deal with concepts of androgyny and a foreign concept of gender, in that the story follows, it is, I guess, technically an alien race, though the premise of the book is there are multiple worlds that a Terran diaspora happened, but each of the different worlds had some sort of a different genetic tweak done to them. And so on this one planet, the particular genetic tweak is that everybody on that planet does not have a gender most of the time, and they are not sexually, available or active most of the time. It's more like like animals where they glow in heat, and when they're in heat, they're sexually active, and when they're not, they're not. So the world is agender when they're not in kimmer, which is what they call going into heat. But when they do go into heat, the body decides somewhat arbitrarily which gender each individual is going to be. So you could become a man during kimmer, you could become a woman during kimmer, and the coupling is a man and a woman, but each individual doesn't have a predetermined idea of what they would and would not be at that moment. And the story follows a standard Terran who's going out on a diplomatic mission, trying to understand this foreign world and this idea. The book is very interesting. I found it a very interesting read. I like the concept quite a lot. The story didn't grab me as much, so I wish it had a story that grabbed me more. But I thought the underlying concepts were really good. The only major critiques I would have would be just based on the time it was released in 1969. So the gender politics of the quote unquote normal human are still steeped in more traditionalist late 60s, early 70s ideas. And there is a use of the male masculine pronoun predominantly for the agendered aspects of the alien race. So those would be my two Sinister suggestions.
Parma, do you have anything you'd like to recommend?
So I guess the first thing I recommend would be to imagine that earlier when we were talking about gender that I brought up Propaganda magazine, because that's completely ridiculous that we did not mention that. Because Fred really did pioneer that kind of gender blending with goth, and it was so beautifully done. He was one of the first photographers in the scene that kind of just used trans males, females, so kind of intertwined and mixed, and there was absolutely no conversation about that aspect of it. It was just so beautifully done, and it didn't really matter. You just looked at the person and was like, wow, they're beautiful, and that was it. But my actual Sinister suggestion would be to look out for a strap-on collection, which I'm releasing soon. And that's going to be kind of fun. And I guess that's kind of sinister because the strap-ons are deer legs and coyote paws and shit like that. So it's going to be fucked up.
This isn't pre-order yet, is it?
Yeah, so order now. Click the link below.
Oh man, I'm super excited about this.
But I guess hopefully some kind of gender theorist will come along and put their 2 cents on it, because I guess that kind of is on topic with gender roles. So yeah. I guess you probably shouldn't use them for their intended purposes, but they're definitely wearable pieces of art. So yeah, that's going to be coming up in the next few weeks.
That is fantastic. Okay, so my Sinister suggestions were music, because I've been trying to introduce people to new music. But I guess on the gender thing, I'll put links in the show notes along with all of this. But Judith Butler, and then a couple ContraPoint videos for the sort of more, I don't want to say beginner, but if you're not familiar with this type of thing, she covers all of that in detail. So I'll put some of my favorite videos of hers in the links of the show notes. So the two bands I'm recommending this month, the first of which is called Special Interest, and they're a Black female fronted band I think they're from New Orleans. I have their page. New Orleans. Yes. And it's really cool, fuck you punk, death rock sort of band. Smash the State, that kind of thing. Really good for that. Really recommend them. And then my other recommendation is Ganser, who I would assume more people are familiar with. But that's more in line with the sort of kind of post-punk traditional sound, but they experiment with other sounds as well, some funk, some other varieties of alternative genres. So those are my two Sinister suggestions. Parma, thank you so much for coming on. It really was a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for taking the time out at like 4 a.m. over there.
Yes, thank you.
No, thanks for having me. It's been wonderful.
Can you let us know where people can find you online, or if there's any specific hub for your works and your art and everything you're doing?
It's actually a good point, because if you type Parma Ham in, you're going to get loads of cured meat. So if you type Parma Ham Goth in, then you will find me. So.
Okay, fair enough. Parma, thank you again so much for coming on the show. It was truly a pleasure to get to chat with you. In 2 weeks, we will be back with a new episode. We're going to be hanging out with the hosts of the Cat vs. Bat podcast, DJ Mistress McCutcheon and DJ Batty Von Bats of Toronto. We're going to be chatting about a range of topics, including fashion. We're going to talk about general philosophies of DJing. We'll touch on politics, religion, the health of the goth scene, the relevance to the industrial scene, and a whole array of other topics. Of course, those of you who support us on Patreon are the reason we are able to continue to create this show, and you have my eternal gratitude. The truth is, if we didn't have your support, this show would no longer be a thing. And so this is why I take the time out every month to thank each and every one of you who have supported us on Patreon and who continue to make this show a reality. So for the month of April, at the founders level, we have Daniel, SJ, Esmeralda, Abigail, Stella, Taya, Samantha, and Christine. Thank you all so much for your continued support for Cemetery Confessions. At the Nocturnal Council level, we have Dawn, Jason, who you can find as Junkyard Bat on Etsy and Facebook, Christina, Esther, Sav, Hey Shaker, Natalie, Michelle, Azzy, one half of Obscura Undead, who you should definitely check out their website and their YouTube channel, Michelle of Skullgirdle RIP, Thomas Cadaver Kelly, another YouTuber who is all putting out great content. You should check her out. Amber, Fifth Dream, Nephilim and Corruptus of YouTube, Eternal Winter of YouTube as well. Definitely give her a look. Stevie, Amy, Mike Mess, and William. And then at the Crow's Call level, we have Dave of the Goth subreddit, r/goth, Isabel, Audra, Kevin, Top Down Tom, Sarah, Morgan, David, Jen, Ritual83, Irene, Barnabas, Abby, Jonathan, Brittle Things, Becca, Kelly, Dom, Michelle, King Rhinex, Vokun, Marco, Alex DeWinter, Eduardo, Jan, Jason, Neon Zigane, great goth rock, metal, synth band. Yes, all of those things. You can go check them out on Bandcamp. Stuart, Isabel, Margarita, Marissa, Jamie, Kimberly, Alex Kennedy, one half of the We Have a Technical podcast, which is part of the idieyouDie.com website. Definitely the place to go for all of your industrial needs. Richard, Mr. Polar Bear, Dagger Dance, Caroline of Caroline Sometimes, someone who I look forward to seeing their Vegete coverage, as it were, Wave Gothic Treffen. Alana, Bronwyn, David, Country Fried Goth, who you can also find on YouTube. Mark, Gendalus, Angel, Anne, Heather, Wolfie, Kelly, Ryan, Gopal Metro of Gopal Metro, who you can find on Patreon and at Metro Pirate Radio on Facebook. Susan, Kay, and Beth. Thank you all so much for your support. If you made it this far in the episode, thank you for hanging out with us. You are clearly one of our super fans, as it were, and I really appreciate you listening. If you have been listening to the show and you've been getting something out of it and you want to help support us for just $1 a month, you can get access to our Discord server, which has a great community, and you can get access to some other benefits, early access to shows, that kind of thing. And then, of course, obviously, higher levels will get you different rewards. I'm working on a new t-shirt design, so keep an eye out for that. Look at the Facebook page. If you're on Patreon, of course, you will be the first to know once that is available. Trying to get the design nailed down, and then hopefully we'll have some brand new t-shirts available in the coming month. So thank you again so much for spending time with us, hanging out with us, chatting, listening to us chat, and chatting back through comments and messages and emails and that kind of thing. We'll be back, of course, in 2 weeks. So until then, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.